I want to take a moment to thank our partners at Marriott Bonvoy for their support of the WBCA and the NABC and this entire Coaches Forum series. So let me introduce Dr. Lindsay Blaum. She is the department chair of the School of Kinesiology and professor of sport and exercise psychology at Ball State University. She is also the faculty rep at Ball State, as well as a member of the NCAA Men's Basketball Oversight Committee. In addition, Dr. Blaum is the current president of ASP, which is the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. So welcome, Dr. Lindsay. And our other great panelist here is Dr. Kelly Thorne. She is the director of Catamount Sports Psychology and Counseling. That's at the University of Vermont. So she works and is embedded in the entire athletics department up at UVM. She is also a licensed psychologist with a background in clinical and sports psychology. So great to have Dr. Kelly with us as well. And I'm Dr. Oliver Eslinger, head men's basketball coach at Caltech. I've been a mental performance consultant for 20 plus years, in addition to my coaching experience, and have worked with athletes and organizations for a couple decades after earning degrees in psychology and counseling and sports psychology. So this is your panel. I know we have a good amount of participants and some folks will be signing on. So we want to go for a good hour here, and I'm sure we're going to dive pretty deep into some of these things. Thank you again for taking the time to share your wisdom and insight, Dr. Lindsay, Dr. Kelly. So we'll get started. Let's start with just these terms, mental health and mental performance. I think, especially in today's society, we see more and more, discussions and terms and phrases thrown out there, but mental health is certainly one that we're seeing now every day, especially with the way that information gets passed around and on social media. So when we say mental health and mental performance, what are we really talking about? And let's dive even deeper into the mental health aspect of it. But how are mental health and mental performance connected? I'll let Dr. Kelly Thorne start out here.
Okay. Yeah, first off, I would say thank you very much for having me today. I really appreciate and looking forward to the conversation. So thanks a lot. I'm glad to be here. In terms of definitions, I think mental health can kind of simply be defined as, our emotional, psychological, and social well-being, and it impacts how we think, feel, and act. And when I think about mental performance, I think about the kind of the mental side of performance. So here, we're talking about athletics, but learning skills that can help to maximize one's potential, increase success, thinking about things, things like confidence, motivation, self-talk, what are people saying to themselves, focus and concentration, emotion regulation, those kinds of things that can really enhance performance. That's simply, I think that's how I would put it, define each.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think those are great definitions. I think one thing as you listen to Kelly's definition of mental health, she included the word well-being in there. And I think sometimes we have this perception that mental health is only when there's a problem. I like to expand the way I look at that and think of like mental health on a continuum, and like it's mental well-being with maybe more extreme situations around mental health sometimes, and then opportunities that we're really thriving and our mental well-being is strong, instead of being kind of like an all or nothing, or just kind of a negative challenge connotation. I think when we think about physical health, we don't typically define it as only a problem. We look at it as on a continuum. So I encourage people to think about mental health on that continuum as well, versus just maybe an all or nothing sort of situation.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, it can get very complex when we're looking at the continuum, whether we're talking one side and going through the sort of the clinical side of what it means to be mentally healthy, and then the other side of it with just pure performance side. And I know that we've even had discussions in our department about the needs for our staff and coaches And are we talking about the performance skills side, the mental training side, which allows us to enhance performance, like some of the topics that you mentioned, such as confidence and attention training, focus, these types of things that go along with cognitive behavioral skills, versus the stuff that people really need more clinical help and licensed practitioner help in certain situations when we get to the depths of even things like stress, anxiety, depression, these kinds of terms. And those are terms that get thrown around too, that people might not necessarily understand. So I think part of this educational seminar too is being able to define these things better, especially for coaches who don't know enough about them or are afraid to ask. Because when we start talking about mental health, people do sort of get have a sense of trepidation with it too, because we're just not sure, am I going to say something that's really going to hurt this person, or have I been doing those kinds of things, or how can I help? So I think the importance of how they're connected and understanding them too is really crucial. So when we think about the connection, what are ways that mental health can impact mental performance, and vice versa, how the performance side can impact mental health?
Yeah, I think, when I think about it, I think if we look at physical health and physical performance, I think many of us coaches and former athletes, current athletes would say you couldn't disconnect them. And so I would say the same thing there with mental health and mental performance. And I know, as practitioners, we separate them in some way by finding resources that maybe fit what is the prominent requests of an individual. But I think as far as a coach understanding them, that they really are connected. They can't be clearly separated. Resources might be designated, but they can't be clearly separated. So I really appreciate your acknowledgement of, and I hear coaches say this all the time, of like, I don't know what it is or where it is, because, go back to my continuum. If I have a continuum, then it doesn't fit in a nice box. And one day, one presents more strongly than another in a certain situation. So I definitely want to honor coaches' concerns about that. It is holistic in that sense. And it is not like clear cut. And I think hoping to easily define them and separate them, we actually need to let go of that desire, because it's just not that easy. And I think if we live in that space, we're going to continue to spin our wheels and be nervous. And then, it doesn't help us kind of own what we can do with those words and those terms. So really encouraging people to think about, they are together. What is presenting, if I'm looking at my team or my athletes right now, my coaching staff, myself, what is presenting right now that I need to deal with first? Is it something around the game tonight? Is it something around my relationships at home? What is presenting right now that is challenging me or causing some distress? And then maybe let's address that versus separating them. And then I think we can get the resources that individual needs at that moment for that, rather than trying to separate them kind of completely. So that's my initial thoughts. I'll let Kelly jump in and we can talk some more about it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the mention of, kind of the desire to separate them, but the need to bring them together and talk about how they work together or not. Sometimes I know sometimes I hear athletes talk about, well, coach will say don't bring it to the locker room, or don't bring it to practice, don't bring, and whatever it is, leave whatever it is, outside of there. And I think that's really hard to do, especially in the busy lives of our student athletes. And they have a lot going on. And sometimes just being able to come to a practice, acknowledge, I'm having a tough day, that exam didn't go as well. Don't have to get into the details, but that can be enough to then focus on what needs to happen at practice. But the holding in sometimes, I think, is what really trips some of our students up. How do I hold that in when I'm really upset about it, but now I have to focus on this, and it gets really jumbled. So I appreciate that. And yet I understand also the desire from coaches or staff to say, like, let's leave that outside of the athletic realm. When I was thinking about this question a little bit, one thing that came to mind was thinking about how sport can be a protective factor for mental health concerns. Like it provides a social outlet or aspect. It provides physical exercise and exertion, can build confidence. There's support, kind of this built-in team of support. But then also we know that the athletic context can also negatively impact mental health, whether it's pressure, trying to meet expectations, time obligations, those kinds of things, athletic identity, feeling like that's the only identity a student has. Injury can certainly throw a wrench into one's sport experience. So thinking about how they really do interplay and can be helpful and sometimes even harmful. And then on the flip side, mental health can impact performance, right? Even if we think about an example of stress, when someone's experiencing stress, muscles might get tense, our ability to focus becomes slightly impaired. It becomes that much harder to do, which can impact performance, impact ability to pay attention during practice. Depression, common symptoms or signs can be decreased motivation, sleep disruption, appetite, changes. And so all of those things we know can certainly impact performance and readiness to perform. So there really is this, this strong connection that I think is great to be talking about.
And just to add on there, I think sometimes the media will promote the moments when someone had an athlete had a crisis situation and then was able to go perform their very best ever.
Yes.
And I think that is just, that can't be an expectation for us. I mean, that is really a human. Same thing if we heard the story of, somebody's injured and they lift a car up to get someone out. I mean, those are just things that aren't really what occurs and really are miracles, not expectations. And so I think kind of owning that is not what we expect, that if that's separate, and then really to know what is more typical, and then how do we balance that, as Kelly mentioned, depending on what's present at the moment.
Yeah, great. I have all these offshoot questions now that I'm writing down here as both of you are talking, because there's so many ways we can go with this. I'm thinking about some recent research and literature on social safety and groups and team building and belonging, and what, especially the aspects that those good aspects of sports can bring to athletes in a college campus. And then at the same time, when you think about even, I guess, traditional coaching, some people might call it as, hey, the athlete walks in and he or she does not look focused, right? Something's wrong. And the coach might just yell at the student athlete, say, hey, get your stuff together. You got to focus right now. And I guess the issue there is, if the athlete hasn't been trained and doesn't really know even necessarily what's bothering him or her, then that is going to sort of distort reality and complicate matters too. So going back to what you mentioned about the presenting problem, and I remember even 20 years ago in grad school, we're talking about, okay, figuring out the presenting issue, what the real problem is. But a lot of times we don't know what the real problem is, right? Especially as coaches. Mm-hmm. Coaches have an agenda. They want to get to the practice. They want to get to the training. And there's so many other things that coaching staffs are thinking about, and not just that human psyche on that day, right? So this sort of leads into the next question of mental health being a difficult topic to discuss and address, especially for young people and also coaches who aren't as familiar with all of these categories. In December of last year, of 2021, the Surgeon General released a memo saying that the US was in a mental health crisis. And so, I mean, obviously we're all humans in the US here. So how is that affecting young people now? And does that sort of keep the cycle going? I mean, is there a situation where just too much of this information coming at us is also bad, especially when we don't know how to filter it?
And just clarifying, by when you say too much information, meaning kind of the information about the crisis, the mental health crisis coming at us, or just as coaches?
Sort of. And I just think about, because I've had lots of discussions with coaches, especially the last couple of years, about social media
Yeah.
and technology, and just and all of our students having phones and devices, and just all of this data information coming at us, and we really don't have time and space to think about what that's doing to us. And I mean, I know there is research on it, but we still don't know enough long term. But yeah, Kelly, specifically about just the mental health crisis and how young people are interpreting that. What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting within the college population, at least recently. I'm forever saying I wish I could get them in the same room, many of them, because I think there's this sense of I'm the only one experiencing this. Nobody else would understand. Particularly during the pandemic, I feel like, the issues around grief and loss were heightened for sure, on so many levels, whether it's within the athletic context to loss of family members, just grieving losses along all the losses along the way of hopes and dreams and things that were supposed to happen and things like that didn't. And I think also a sense of loneliness. So even despite all of this technology and all of the ways that we can connect, I feel like the theme of loneliness has been greater than I remember. I've been at UVM about 18 years now in different roles within the counseling center. And I just don't recall hearing so many students talk about being lonely. And the students I'm talking to are students who are on a team, right? So most people would probably think, well, they're not lonely. They have a group of built-in friends. And sometimes they're even teammates that are saying they're lonely on the same team. And I just want to pull them together, let them know they're not alone. And I think there's a lot going on, and there's a lot that's not being talked about peer to peer, or talked about in a way that goes maybe as deep as we would hope it would. Social media is showing one thing, it's not always the reality. And even though cognitively and intellectually students know that they might be seeing only the best of their friends, it's still hard to kind of negotiate that. If you're having a really tough time and everybody else seemingly is doing well, it's hard to remember that maybe that's not quite as perfect or as good as it looks on social media. So some of the things that I feel like thinking about it from a coaching standpoint, when I hear athletes talk about ways in which coaches have allowed for opportunity to talk about non-sport things, we get together and we have little pods within our team, and we meet for a meal, or we go get coffee, or we have a snack, and we talk about books, or we talk about movies, or we talk about just other interests that we have. It's refreshing, and I think the students actually really appreciate those types of opportunities too. And then out of that, oftentimes, the students are more able to talk about things when they're struggling, or when they're having difficulties, or they might be more apt to approach a teammate if they notice some changes, if they've already had kind of these other conversations and are getting to know one another in different contexts. But I'll stop here. I could keep talking about that piece, but I'll let others chime in. But I do, and the other thing I guess I would say is, we all know we are working really hard to decrease the stigma around mental health, specifically in athletics. That was in large part why CSPC was even started 5 years ago or whatnot at UVM. And I know we're seeing more and more positions posted within college athletic departments for mental health providers in-house. And so we're getting there. The more we can make it kind of normal to talk about, this is something that we just bring up, you're going to see it, you're going to see resources, you're going to see people around. I think all the better for getting students to talk about what's going on and to engage in help-seeking behavior, to reach out for help. I think our professional and elite athletes have helped with that immensely within the last 5 to 10 years too. The number of athletes coming forward, talking about their own struggles and how they've reached out for help is really helpful for our college population too.
Yeah, those are great points. I think when I thought about this question, I thought about two main things, I think, for young people, because I think while mental health is a stigma for lots of different stakeholders, it's kind of the stigma around it, the barriers around it differ, I think, a little bit at times. But before I enter that, I want to say something about the social media part. I was at our MAC conference meetings in May, and we had student athletes who were sharing their experiences. and what somebody asked a student athlete her thoughts about social media and impact, and she said it feels like we're always on. Someone can always snap a picture, someone can always record you, someone can always look at you, evaluate you, critique you, whether you give permission or not. And so she's like, especially as female athletes, we feel like at home, in our dorm rooms, walking to camp, like not just about athletics, but in general. And I think I hadn't really thought about that way, because it's not the same for me as an older adult about that. But I could see that pressure where they're really concerned, like every moment could be captured willingly or unwillingly, and then evaluated. And so that creates a whole nother element. So there may be some things we can speak of about what that looks like, respectfully or not, a little bit more. I haven't specifically addressed those with our student athletes, but something about, if you don't like that, maybe you should be careful of that with others too. So that's something that I thought about as we go into our fall semester, kind of talking with teams a little bit more about what that looks like to others, unwillingly. So my two main areas I was going to say about for young people, I think, young people especially are at a time when we say, develop your identities, find your strengths, figure out who you really are, and then, share those with the world as you seek your next opportunity. And so to me, it's like counterintuitive to say, well, as you're doing that, be vulnerable. Tell us what's wrong and go find someone, tell them your challenges, but we want you to focus on, what you're really good at and finding your identity. And so I think we're asking them to develop into, older adults that have it all put together, and then saying, but why you have challenges with seeking support. And so I think we're sending multiple messages that way. So continuing to figure out how this support along the way supports their identity development or allows them to find their strengths, versus kind of saying maybe they're opposite. And we know that as professionals, but I think they don't always hear that as young people about how they actually work together. Just like if you were not very good at hitting, you would go work on hitting, which doesn't mean you're never going to be a good hitter. It just means you want to get better at that. So continuing to find ways to help them grow and see how those fit together, rather than acknowledge weakness in something. And then I think the other part in sport is I don't know about you all, but I feel like I can remember many, many times when I had a coach say, like, don't walk, don't slow down, keep it going, go fast, go harder, go stronger. I was a soccer player. And so walking was like a total weakness. Like you just didn't do it. And so even after I was done with soccer, I couldn't even go for a family walk, because I had that coaches in my mind saying, don't walk, don't walk, don't walk. So I think we ask athletes, it is very much supported to move, go, do, and train. And a lot of mental well-being, mental health, mental performance work involves reflecting and slowing down. And I'm not talking just like meditation, but I'm talking introspectiveness, reflection, talking, being still. And that again is counterintuitive to what we're saying makes necessarily a good athlete. I find that actually some of the athletes that I work with who are in sports that slow down, like rifle, they are much better at this, because they're slowing down as part of what their performance includes. But then there's other sports like basketball and soccer that slowing down is not what we want. And I know coaches really don't mean that. We don't really mean that, but I think that's what they pick up when they're hearing messages, that more movement and more activity is better. And sometimes mental health is seemingly the opposite of that.
Another piece I was going to add, just I think, if it ties into how people perceive, mental health in general, but also counseling, is also factoring in and being cognizant of cultural differences. Like for a lot of people, it's easy to say, for some people to say, you should go to counseling, you should talk to somebody. But I see a number of student athletes who are, this is not okay in my family, for me to be here even, or I talk about mental health and my family doesn't necessarily believe in mental health and, that idea, or, getting help for that, or sharing some of what, that being vulnerable and sharing what might be going on with other people. And so I think that's another piece that, there are a lot of ways to get support around mental health, and it doesn't always have to be coming in to see a licensed clinician, right? There's a lot of support on our campuses. And so I think that's another important piece too, that it's not a one size fits all, and recognizing that and having some alternatives or options.
Yeah, thank you. So Lindsay, when you're talking about having space and being able to reflect, I think it was Lindsay talking about that, right? I was thinking, so in basketball, a popular phrase in terms of playing style is pace and space.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of basketball coaches talk about playing with pace and space, and whether that means playing faster or playing at a pace that allows us to sort of self-regulate our own system. But totally, it could be applied to what we're talking about here.
Yeah,
You know?
I love it.
So being able to reflect, being able to be self-aware, understanding what we're saying to ourselves, what is the story that we're telling ourselves, how are we influencing ourselves and interpreting the world around us. So, I mean, these are obviously key fundamental aspects in psychology, and being able to be very self-aware and understanding how our thoughts, feelings, behaviors affect the next thing and the next week. So, I mean, totally great point. And then in terms of thinking about being lonely or being connected, Kelly, and taking that time to share, I know that, and I guess I have an advantage in terms of I'm on and have been on both sides of this, you know, for my career as the coach, and then also sort of the performance consultant person as well, whether it's with my own team or working with another organization. But I know that coaches are afraid to take that time, right? Because there's so much they want to get to on court and strength and conditioning wise, and in the video room. One thing that I'll share that we've done, and we integrate mental training and mental performance into our weekly schedule. And obviously we're able to do that because of the resources that we have on the coaching staff. But what about coaches who don't have that necessarily? And I know we are seeing more positions at, especially the Division I level, when we're talking about either a clinical person and or a performance person. But what about, do you have any suggestions, I guess, for coaches who want to do more and don't know what to do? And one example I'll give is Greg Popovich from the San Antonio Spurs. I've been able to see him in practice. And one thing they do, this fits into the different athletes coming from all over the world, right? And cultural differences. Because the Spurs were one of the first teams to find players outside of the US. So they're coming from all different countries, and the same thing I've seen having been at MIT and Caltech, and we get players from all over the world. And it's such a key thing to understand that if we have a player from Germany or from Australia or from Cyprus, that person might not understand our strategy, what we're doing, our terms. I mean, it's very lonely, homesick. So Popovich he'll bring the team together before practice starts and ask one of the players to share something about his life and how he grew up. And so, I mean, this is huge because, yeah, it's not about basketball necessarily, but it's about sharing and with the team. And when we've done things like that, it's about communicating. It's just getting the athletes to talk to one another. And that we know, even psychologically and when we talk about connectedness, helps them become more cohesive. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and what coaches could really do to support that part of it.
Go ahead, Kelly, I'll let you start with.
I was going to say, go ahead, Lindsay. Yeah, I mean, I think opportunities like that, you know, it's like I was mentioning before too about, you know, these smaller groups of people within a team that are getting together, and that might, you know, transcend, you know, class. So you may have some first years with some seniors and whatnot. So they are getting to know one another. And I think opportunities for that, I don't think it has to take too much time. And in the end, I actually think it could prevent more time being taken away, focused on some of the things that could come up. You know, I think that the more you build, I mean, there's research that out there that talks about, you know, building a caring climate, you know, and all that can do for not only and there's some research showing that it does have a positive impact on performance too, but it's creating this climate of value, everyone from, the coaches to managers, and any support staff all feel like a valued member of the program, or, this one team, creating, this culture where kindness is okay. We extend it, we welcome it. Comfort, this is a comfortable place. It might not always feel comfortable from a physical standpoint or a being pushed kind of standpoint, we're going to ask a little bit. It's not about setting, low expectations by any means, but it's creating this environment where there is this sense of value and mutual respect. And I think that can lead to increased, effort. It can lead to fun. It leads to more hopefulness, commitment. The relationships, I think, as you're speaking to, is more cohesive within the team, and maybe amongst the team and the coaches. And so, thinking about how do you set that up? What are some things that coaches can do to set that up? How do you create a welcoming environment? How do you if you want to have an open door, how do you have that open door, but do it in a way that meets different styles? Maybe not all coaches want to have their door open all the time, and that's okay. And other coaches, I'm available whenever you need me. There's no right or wrong to that, but you can set up a welcoming, open door type atmosphere in whatever style fits for you. And I think the checking in, I was really reminded, a student, this sticks with me because it really mattered to the student. We had, a student who was out with an injury and early morning practices, and was really, the thing she missed the most was the banter with her coach. And so she was literally getting up and going to her early morning practice just to get some engagement with her coach, because she really loved the sense of humor. She liked being able to banter back and forth. Like, that doesn't take a lot of time. Coach probably had no idea that even mattered, or that it was having an impact. So I think that's the other thing, is that it's really easy to kind of forget the impact that coaches have all the time on their athletes. And sometimes, and I say this sometimes in counseling in a way too, like the things I think that are the most profound, a year later, a student will tell me, when you said this, or when we talked about that, and it's like the most basic sentence I could have said. But that's what had an impact. And I think the same is with coaches. And so it doesn't have to, it's like the quality of it versus the quantity of the time. Like, it doesn't have to be these huge amounts of time set aside that feel like they're taking away from practice and all of that. But it's the quantity of the quality of the interactions. And maybe it's even creating space for those quality interactions to happen on a regular basis. But, and I encourage coaches to talk to each other about ideas, because I think, you all have some great ideas that you're already doing, and can really learn and, throw things around with one another, which I think can be really helpful. Hopefully
I love your focus on culture and climate, because I think that's what the athletes are living, regardless of how many sports psychology consultants or mental health practitioners they have around them. Their culture within their team is what they're living. I mean, I remember very vividly early in my career being a consultant for a team, and everything we talked about in our meetings with coaches and with athletes, nothing looked like that from the coaching staff in their practices. And it was such a disconnect that the athletes were almost more confused in that setting. And it wasn't working at all. And so it was really that it didn't matter how much she paid anybody to come do this work, that if she didn't really buy into this quality of culture, it really didn't matter what other resources she brought in. And so I think coaches forget sometimes that they are the key component to all of it. And so even if they don't have a practitioner to bring in, or that they can still be doing a lot of these things, I think that there are books and webinars and things like that that can give coaches ideas. I think talking to you, coach, about, as a coach, what do you do, what's working, I think is very helpful. And I think that coaches can also work with a consultant themselves. So maybe there's not time for the whole team to work, but maybe the consultant says, let me go do this first. One, I can kind of see what I think about this individual and how the fit is with our team, but I can get ideas. I mean, I love working with coaches because I think the ripple effect is even bigger than an individual athlete. The depth might be with an individual athlete, but the ripple effect can be enormous. And I think so coaches don't always think about that as an opportunity, that maybe it's not always getting into their designated 20 hours or 40 hours a week, whatever it may be for the time of season, but they can go get those resources. And then I think beyond that, that oftentimes letting athletes know about this resource that they can seek out, on their own with almost approval from the coach also helps. Like I say, coaches say, like, we give them the resources and we go. And I say, yes, but you do tell them, like, you're okay with this person or this idea or doing this, that is totally fine. And they're like, well, no, I didn't know I need to. And I think, yeah, I said, they're following your lead. And so if you say either I'm doing this work or it's totally fine for you to go see this individual, that can also be really helpful too. So I think you can see I like continuums, but I think there's a continuum of what services and involvement look like. And so coaches at different times of their season and different times of their career can do more or less for their teams and for their individuals, and don't have to feel like they have to, have it all the time.
Great points. I'm taking away that what we know is we're always impacting, we're always influencing as coaches, and then on the other side, as you sort of alluded to, we're being impacted as coaches. We're being influenced, and sometimes we are very aware of how we're being influenced, and other times we're not. And so things can sort of stream in the subconscious, and that's a lot of times that's how stressors can build up during the season, especially when coaches are just trying to get to the next practice and get to the next game, the next scout. So let me go to this next question, because it'll tie into what we're talking about, of course. But recently, Premier Sports Psychology, they're a big time organization in the Twin Cities area in Minnesota. They have a research team there, and they just came out with a published study suggesting that the ability to manage setbacks, and this is by the athletes, is a primary concern, followed by education and training of mental skills. So we know that setbacks are certainly linked to health and well-being away from the competitive environment. So what is a coach supposed to do with that sort of information? Coaches are not licensed mental health practitioners, but what are some of the signs to look for when we're talking about the players and the rest of their staff, and then also themselves?
Yeah, I think when I was reading about this, I thought setbacks, what a great term to capture just obstacles in our world. And I think those look, someone's definition of a setback could be, a flat tire, so I'm a little late, to, my path has now been drastically changed from what I thought it was going to be for the rest of my life, and everything in between. And I think, coaches often ask, like, my athletes all had the same setback, and why are they experiencing it so differently? Why are some able to play just as fine and some are not, and some are playing better? And I think, when we think about stressors, which I would classify any setbacks as a form of stress, that it, at the moment, the individual's ability to have enough resources to meet the demand is what we're looking at. And so time of season, some setbacks are more intense than other times of the season, even if it's the same situation. Final exams at the end of a intense season, at a time when everybody's lower on sleep and physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted, trying to make a playoffs or something, that looks different than a test that might come at the beginning of the season when everybody feels refreshed. So I think understanding that setbacks are really individually experienced and experienced differently at different times in the same person's life. And that's okay. And so I think that, to me, for a coach to look at, like, what are the behavior changes that I'm seeing? So coach calls me and I'll say, like, so what's the same or different about this person? Because they're like, I'm really worried about it. And they might say, well, actually nothing. Like, I know this happened, but I'm seeing her show up. I'm seeing her engage. I'm seeing her laugh. I'm seeing her, she's going to classes. And so I'm like, okay, let's just keep monitoring. It doesn't mean it's not an issue, but maybe she's handling it okay. Other times they'll say, like, they're running late. And I know 5 minutes late to somebody is a big deal, sometimes. Or they'll mention different smaller behaviors that the coach knows are significant, even though they might be minor to somebody who doesn't know the athlete as well. So I really ask about some of the behaviors that have changed, and what they think of those behaviors, and then can kind of figure out what resources might come in, because ultimately we want to try to prevent the setback from impacting more parts of their world or causing more stress than is already being experienced.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. That's exactly what I would say too, is behavioral changes. And in some ways, all the more reason to kind of have these opportunities to get to know and to really be kind of in tune with the athlete, because then you can recognize, you see those changes and you can approach, a student athlete about that. I mean, we have those conversations a lot with coaches at UVM of like, we're not expecting people to be doing any diagnosing. We're not expecting them to be doing any assessment around mental health. I think of it as, what would you, if you notice some of these things in a friend or a family member or a loved one, what would you want to do? How would you approach that? Think of it from that angle. But we are kind of asking to kind of be able to maybe recognize some of these signs or symptoms that things might not be okay. And I think something that you mentioned, Lindsay, made me think also of, sometimes it's the ones that seem totally okay and never have anything going on are also the ones that we need to be checking in on too, that because an event or something might have happened in someone's life and it's not showing up in the same way maybe it did for someone else, doesn't necessarily mean that they're not struggling. For a lot of athletes, the athletics or their sport is the outlet. And so they might be able to show up and just let it go and just do what they need to do and focus. And then they'll pick it up kind of afterwards. But it's there, and it might be impacting other parts of their life, the academic side, the social side, or things like that. But, a lot of times I think coaches, us people in general, not just coaches, but we're talking to coaches, it was, how do I approach this? What do I do if I see these things? And sometimes coaches might talk amongst themselves and decide who is like the best person to start a conversation. Maybe it's an assistant coach that has a relationship already with that person. Maybe it's strength and conditioning. Maybe it's the team doc, whoever, to maybe initiate it. And I always encourage people to use those behaviors that they're seeing, those changes, rather than hi, how are you? Right? What's the response we're usually going to get? I'm good. I'm okay. I'm fine. But if we say, gosh, I noticed that you're kind of quiet in practice recently. That's not like you. Is everything going okay? It's like, it also is a sign that someone's noticing. So they might choose not to say much, but they're holding that in their head like, oh, coach noticed that something's off. I don't really feel like talking about it today, but maybe the next time coach says, hey, still seeming quiet, just want to check in, maybe that's an opening. So it really can have a big impact just naming what is being observed and what those changes are.
Yeah, that's great. I was thinking about just various interventions that we've tried as a coaching staff with different teams and over the years. And they don't have to be perfect, and they don't even necessarily have to work. But I think the point that we're making is, if we're trying as coaches, the intention is good, that we're noticing we want to adapt, we want to be flexible here, we want to make some changes for the good and be positive in different ways. So just the simple act of trying for 5 minutes to get the team to share, or by daily check-ins, however we want to do that, however we want to engage in those check-ins, definitely important. And certainly having a balanced staff where some assistants are really good and have a relationship with these folks over here, and another assistant might have a better relationship over here. And so sort of maximizing that, I think, is important. I think a lot of times head coaches can be over controlling and not necessarily want assistants to do that, but in reality, that's what the group needs, as we're sort of getting to know everybody and having different relationships and connections with each person in the program. So that's sort of the philosophy that we abide by. In terms of the role of coaches and it does seem to be getting more complex. And I think part of that is again, because of all this information there's at our fingertips and right in front of us all the time. And certainly even during the pandemic, there were lots and lots of webinars and coaching forums where people were stuck at home and were sharing, and those were obviously really good for folks who are interested in it. But what can coaches do more to address the stress on themselves? One of the things I noticed too is during the season, for instance, coaches are so busy that they don't really want to reach out, or don't think they have the time to reach out to even their good buddies. So for instance, I try to make it a point to stay connected with people as we're going through the weeks of everything, because we do need that, because otherwise, especially as a head coach, you feel very isolated and lonely as well. So we know that build up after year after year after the year can really affect one's lives, right? And consider depression and burnout and emotional upheaval in different ways. So what do you two have to suggest and advise on that matter?
Let's just start. I mean, I think, I always say a lot, consult, like try to talk to one another, whether it's someone in coaching profession, whether it's someone outside that knows you, a former mentor, a current mentor. It might be a sports admin, in the athletic department. It might be seeking out one's own counseling, opportunity. Or I've had coaches that have reached out to me to say, I think I might be interested in talking with someone, and we can help make that referral for them or get them some names. And so I do think there is kind of, how can coaches kind of model this self-care or help-seeking behavior that we're encouraging in the student athletes, and identifying knowing boundaries, I think, is really important, particularly when we're talking about supporting others' mental health, right? It's much harder to be there for other people, whatever role you're in, as a coach or a friend or a loved one, if our cup is half empty, right? And so if we can fill our own cup, we're more apt to be able to be in a better place to help and support someone else. And recognizing those boundaries, I think coaches feel a lot of pressure sometimes that they have to always be available in some capacity, to respond to answer to fix, to solve all of those pieces. And that's a lot, and it's too much sometimes. And being able to recognize one's own boundary, what do you need to fuel up? How can others support you in that, I think, is really important and hard. It can be hard to admit sometimes that maybe you need that from others, or calling in other people to help support. But I think it's really important, for oneself, just to engage in self-care, know what you need for self-care.
Yes, I was definitely going to go the self-care route as well. And I think, when we start to get full days, I think the things that go are sleep, good food, exercise, and social support. And those are the things that are fundamental to quality of life. And they go with our athletes, they go with our staff, they go with ourselves, they go with, any kind of really situation. And it's easy to be like, well, I got to give up something to put more in. And I say, I don't disagree. I do that same thing to myself at times. But I say, the bottom line is self-care is not convenient to other people. It's for the benefit of other people, because we now are ready to give our best. And so there isn't going to be ever a time that someone takes a day off or an afternoon off or takes a nap or whatever it may be, that someone's like, oh, really, that was really convenient that you just left for that hour that day when I needed you. Nobody's ever going to say that. So, but at the same time, once we start doing it, we realize what the return on that investment is. So coaches make those decisions all the time, return on investment for lots of different things. And this is a return on investment of their health, quality of life for their families, for their jobs, for their staff, for their student athletes, for themselves. And so I said, we have to give ourselves permission to do those things. It is certainly a model, because I feel like a few years ago, I really made this change in my life. And as soon as I gave myself permission for self-care, I realized how much more generous I was to everybody else around me. When they are like, I need something, I'm like, yes, of course, go take it. And they're like, oh, okay. Because before, I think I was envious that they were taking self-care. I was like, why can't I do that? And I realized it was me that was in the way of that. So I gave myself permission. I gave them permission, and it's not convenient. You just have to give up. Like, there's no good time. If you wait for that good time, it won't occur. So do it when you need to. I mean, there might be better times than others, but do it when you need to, and then get back and give your best. The other thing I'd say is there can be small things. Like, it doesn't have to be a week at the beach. It could be small things. I realize that I need 10 or 15 minutes every morning to ground myself. It looks a variety of ways depending on where I am and what I'm doing, and it drastically impacts my life. So when I get home, my kids will notice. They'll be like, oh, you didn't meditate this morning, did you? I'm like, yeah, no, I didn't. They can feel it in the way that I am by 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the rest of my hope for the day, my optimism, my strength. And it only takes me a little bit of time in the morning, but it really can reset me. So I encourage coaches to think about small things that make them happy and bring some joy, and the bigger things that maybe are more impactful long-term too.
That's great. Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes remaining. We do have, a number of questions that we're not going to be able to get to today, but I'll keep going with one or two of them. But I do want to acknowledge that we have a bunch of attendees here who are taking this hour with us. So if any coaches or anyone listening, watching wants to throw a question in the chat, if you're just really itching to get something out there, please throw it in, and we'll try to address it as we're finishing up here. But once again, thank you for sticking with us on these deep topics. So I guess along the lines of coach support too, colleges and universities, like we said, different levels, different resources. When coaches do need more help or just want to figure out which pathway to go, and there's not necessarily a full-time sports psychologist there or mental health person that they know, whatever it is, what are some ways that you have seen coaches work with administration to make something happen?
I think I've been having these discussions in multiple settings for multiple years. And what I think has actually worked the best in a variety of areas when we're looking for kind of like the final push, when people know something is good, but it just really need to change, is hearing from the individuals themselves that would be most impacted. And so at our MAC conference May meetings, the student athletes stood up at the end and addressed all the athletic directors and a group in the room and said, we need you to prioritize mental health resources in your budget. We know the budgets aren't changing. They know there's not extra money coming down, but this is a request from us. So help us find out ways to move things around to prioritize this. And we know that looks different in all different budgets, but I think the ADs in the room and the conversations that I had at Ball State afterwards, they heard that message. And I know that's coming from the NCAA as well. And I think there will continue as the transformation committee at the NCAA is continuing to work. I think it's going to look a little bit different on what the NCAA asks different divisions to do to be part of that membership. And I think one of them is going to be around mental health. So I think we're at the point where nobody really needs to be convinced that it should be done. We just need to do it. And sometimes we got to just rip the Band-Aid off and do it. Yes, something else won't get funded because we have to fund this because we don't have more money, or we can be creative. And so what's great about universities is there might be more resources on the university than coaches have even thought about before, athletic directors thought about before. We just got an opportunity to bring in the athletic department is funding a graduate assistantship for a counseling psych doc student who's also trained in sports psychology. So they're starting there, which we hope to grow, a lot, but that's a way to kind of start using some resources. And the student that's filling this is also very excited to do that. So I think there are a lot of small ways to start and build. And I'm sure you all have done lots of different things too, but I think sometimes they think again about it being this multi-million-dollar leap. And I think there's other ways on campuses, especially if you're in a bigger city. You can find people who are certified or licensed, depending on what area you're looking for, that can really fulfill. I also feel like sports social work is another area that's growing. And we have a social work department, and they're interested in those connections. So I think there's sometimes the counseling department, sometimes there's a sports psychology program, sometimes there's social work. So there may be a variety of areas on campus that could at least move the ball a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I have too much more to add than that. I do think, hearing you mention kind of that creativity piece of trying, sometimes, if the resources aren't there right now, how do you get creative in kind of building a network of support? And that can be, thinking about campus partners, whether it's people in the counseling center. Part of my role when I was in our main counseling center for a number of years, I was a liaison. So a lot of college counseling centers, they set up liaison relationships. So each staff member is a liaison to res life, athletics, et cetera, different offices on campus. And I was a liaison to athletics. So I went to some meetings, I did trainings, I was getting a lot of direct referrals, but I was also there for coaches, that coaches could call and just consult about something. We'd figure out what resources were needed. I wasn't embedded or in-house, but there was kind of that contact. So even just having a person that is like your go-to contact can sometimes be helpful. It feels a little bit closer. You're not just calling and leaving a voicemail for, you don't know who's going to respond to that or whatnot. Building relationships with others in health promotion centers or wellness centers on campus can be really helpful. There's a lot of programming that's going on campus that our student athletes are often not able to get to, but that can help alleviate some of the stress or maybe the focus that's put on coaches. I think also, identity centers, building relationships with identity centers on campus can be really useful too. They're amazing support people and can be really helpful in a variety of different situations and day to day and supportive of coaches. So there can be some creative ways to almost create a little network of support if it is, too much right now to have someone in-house.
That's great.
And we actually use that network too. So even if you have somebody in-house, we rely on that network as well. But
that's great. Yeah, thank you. So as we have a couple minutes left, I know that it flew by. I knew it would.
Yeah.
There's just so much critical information here and different ways we could take it. And I have a bunch of notes, so I'm sure we'll be following up, just our group too. But any closing thoughts, parting words that maybe we didn't get to, or just something you want to hit on here before we finish?
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. Please reach out to the professionals around you, even if you don't know if it's the right skill set or not, because typically they'll help you find resources. You're not alone, and you have such a powerful impact as coaches and administrators on our young people that we want to do whatever we can to support you and them. So I think the opportunity to have these conversations is crucial. So thank you for supporting that.
And I would second that too. I really appreciate being part of the conversation and really appreciate people attending and listening in. And hopefully, there are some ideas that can be takeaways. I would say too, I'm always open for questions. If there's anything that I can do to help support some of this movement forward in departments, I know, even with the most well-intentioned ideas, sometimes we have seen some situations where there needs to be more coordination between positions, and where's the position housed and who oversees it and all of that. And I have a lot to say on that. It's a whole other webinar, but as people are talking about it, I'm always happy to share, different models that I've heard that schools are using or what we're seeing out there and what seems to be helpful or lessons learned from places. So just really appreciate being here. So thanks for the time.
Yeah, it's great to sit down and do this with both of you. I love this, always learning. There's always something we can pick up as coaches and practitioners. And something I enjoy too is nobody asked any questions here that was any of our attendees. None of them asked anything, but I'm sure they have questions. So please reach out to us as a group or individually. Email me, hoopitup@caltech.edu if you want. And I'd be glad to engage in these conversations. So yeah, thanks again to both of you for taking the time and sharing your information. Thank you to everyone that was here, and especially to our partners at Marriott Bonvoy for sponsoring the event. This webinar will, if you missed any of it, people are here, or if you have coaches that just weren't able to be here, let them know that there will be a full replay of it, and that'll be available on WBCA.org and NABC.com pretty soon, I believe, after this is shut down. The WBCA and NABC coaches forums will continue, and so be on the lookout for other topics, or maybe we'll do a follow-up with this one. I think that would be very helpful. And thanks for tuning in, everybody. Great to have you here.